The waiting room at the Veterans Affairs office was packed. Tired faces, quiet murmurs, the soft hum of the air conditioner overhead. It smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. People shifted in their seats, holding papers, eyes, folders, waiting for their turn to be called. A man in his late 60s stepped inside. He moved slowly but with a kind of quiet strength. His boots were worn, his jacket plain. His eyes scanned the room, then he walked straight to the front desk. The young officer behind the counter looked up, chewing gum and scrolling something on his computer screen. "Next," he said without looking. The man stepped forward and handed over an old military ID. It was scratched, edges curled, the kind of card that had seen better days. The officer took one look at it and let out a short laugh. "Whoa," he said, turning the card toward his coworker beside him. "Look at this thing. It's practically from the Stone Age." His coworker leaned over. "Does it even have a chip in it? Or was it from back when they carved eyes on stone tablets?" They both laughed. The man didn't say anything. He just stood there calm. He didn't seem angry, maybe just tired. "Sir," the officer said, still grinning, "this had expired." "What? 15 years ago? I mean, come on. You gotta keep these things updated. You can't just walk in with ancient history and expect access." A few people in the waiting room looked up. Some raised eyebrows. A few turned back to their papers. The older woman behind the counter held the ID with both hands, her eyes scanning every corner of it. She didn't say anything at first. The younger officer, still smirking, leaned back in his chair like he'd just won something. "It's expired," he said again, as if she hadn't noticed. "I told them already. Looks like it's from the last century." The woman didn't respond. She just kept staring at the name on the card, her eyebrows slowly pulled together, her mouth pressing into a thin line. "Do you know who this is?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the card. The officer shrugged. "Some guy with a fossil for an eye." That's when she looked up, straight at him. That some guy could have outranked your entire family tree. The officer blinked. The room went even quieter. You could hear the squeak of a chair shifting across the tile. The woman turned back to the man. "Sir," she said gently, "would you mind waiting just a moment? I'll be right back." The man gave a small nod. Of course. She walked away quickly, still holding the card, disappearing into the back office. The young officer looked confused now. Not nervous yet, just unsure. He tried to play it off, turning to the others behind the counter. "She's probably overreacting. I mean, it's just an old eye. How important can he be if he's walking in here like that?" No one answered him. The man stayed where he was, standing near the desk, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He didn't seem bothered by the wait. He looked around the room slowly, as if studying the walls, the people, the little details no one else noticed. A young man sitting nearby leaned over to the woman next to him and whispered, "Did you hear what she said? Outranked his family tree." "Maybe he was a general," she replied quietly. "Maybe he was the general," someone else added. Meanwhile, the officer tapped a pen against the desk, clearly trying to stay cool. "I mean, come on," he said, but his voice didn't have the same confidence anymore. If he was that important, wouldn't he have people to take care of this stuff for him? Again, no one said a word. A few minutes passed, then 5. The door to the back office opened slowly and the woman returned. She wasn't alone. She was holding a phone out in front of her like it was something precious. "This call is for you," she said to the officer, her voice serious. "They're waiting." The officer furrowed his brow. "Who is it?" She met his eyes and said, clearly, "The Pentagon." The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. The ripples reached everyone. Heads turned, eyes widened. The officer stood up slowly. "The Pentagon?" "Yes," she said. "And they know exactly who he is." The officer stood frozen, staring at the phone in the woman's hand. It was as if the words "the Pentagon" had somehow stopped time for him. The man in front of the desk remained quiet, his expression still calm, though his eyes now seemed sharper, as if he knew exactly what was happening and wasn't at all surprised by it. The officer's hand hovered over the phone, unsure whether to take it or back away. A wave of doubt hit him. He wasn't used to feeling like this. He was the one in control, right? But now with the Pentagon on the line, he felt like a kid again, and way over his head. "Sir," the woman said gently, "they're waiting." The officer swallowed hard. He glanced at his coworkers, but none of them said a word. They were all watching, eyes wide, some with their mouths slightly open. "Hello," the officer said, finally taking the phone. His voice cracked a little as he held it to his ear. "We have confirmation," came a voice on the other end. It was deep and clipped, as if the person on the line was reading from a script. "General Richardson is indeed in our system, and his clearance level is above your pay grade. He is one of the most decorated officers in recent history. You will provide him the service he requires immediately." The officer's face drained of color. The words echoed in his head. General Richardson. The name alone sent a chill through him. He glanced quickly at the man in front of him, the same man who had stood patiently, no sign of arrogance or expectation. The same man who had been mocked for something as simple as an expired eye. And now the Pentagon itself was on the line, confirming his status. "Ah, yes, sir," the officer stammered into the phone. "Of course, sir. I'm very sorry for the misunderstanding. I'll take care of it right away." He paused, listening, then nodded, though no one could see him. "Understood. I will make sure he's taken care of immediately," he said, his voice now steady, but still carrying the weight of the moment. He hung up the phone and looked at the woman. She was still standing there, waiting. The air in the room had shifted, something had changed, and the tension was palpable. The officer turned to the man. His posture was different now, more respectful. "Sir," he said, voice low, "I sincerely apologize for how I spoke to you earlier. That was completely out of line. We'll get everything sorted out. No more delays." The man didn't say anything. He just nodded slightly, as though accepting the apology without any need for further words. He didn't look angry. He didn't look smug either. He simply waited for the next step. The officer felt a knot loosen in his stomach, but only just. He glanced at his coworkers, who were still trying to process what had just happened. The woman behind the counter gave a small nod, signaling the officer to get moving. The room was silent now. No more jokes, no more chatter, just the soft clicking of keyboards and the quiet shuffle of papers. The officer stepped around the desk, his movements faster now. He made sure to take the man's expired id gently, almost reverently, as though it were made of fragile glass. And for the first time that day, he truly seemed to understand the weight behind those worn edges. The officer took a step back, still holding the expired id in his hands, his fingers lightly brushing the edges. His mind was racing, trying to process the call from the Pentagon, the sudden shift in the air, the way the man had stood there so quietly through it all. The woman behind the counter, who had remained silent during the call, finally spoke again. Her voice was soft but firm. "Sir," she said, her eyes locked onto the officer, "you need to make sure this man is treated with the respect he deserves. We don't have all the details, but there's a reason why the Pentagon's involved." The officer looked at her, his expression tense. "I know, I just didn't know who he was." The woman sighed, shaking her head. "You don't always know, do you? Sometimes the most important people walk in here looking like everyone else, and that's why you never assume." The officer glanced at the man again, now feeling the weight of his mistake. He'd been so quick to judge, so quick to make assumptions based on an old, faded eye. But the call from the Pentagon, the woman's words, it all hit him like a ton of bricks. The man, still standing quietly by the counter, seemed unaffected by the sudden change in the room's energy. His calmness made everything around him seem smaller, as if he was used to this kind of attention, even if he didn't seek it. The officer took a deep breath. He was about to apologize again when the woman spoke up once more, this time in a voice barely above a whisper. "His name's General Richardson," she said softly, as if saying the name out loud made it somehow more real. "He's one of the most decorated officers in the history of the military. Served in multiple wars, led countless operations. You've probably heard of him, but you never knew his face." The officer felt his heart skip a beat. General Richardson. The name seemed to carry more weight than he realized. It wasn't just any name. It was a name that had shaped history. It was a name that demanded respect, not mockery. He didn't know how to respond. He just insulted a man who had seen more, done more, and sacrificed more than he could ever imagine. He glanced again at the man, who was still standing there, waiting, as if he were used to moments like this. Moments when his identity wasn't immediately recognized, when his presence was underestimated. The officer cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. "I'm sorry, General," he said, his words slow but sincere. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." The general nodded slightly, the barest of acknowledgments. He didn't seem to care for the apology. In fact, he barely seemed to notice it. It was as though he had learned long ago that words didn't matter as much as actions did. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next step. The officer, still holding the id, took a moment before looking back at the general. "Let's get this taken care of," he said, his voice now steady and professional. "No more delays, I promise." The general gave him another small nod. No words, no judgment, just the quiet understanding that some things, some people, didn't need any explanation. The officer, still holding the old id, walked quickly toward the back office. His feet moved faster now, a sense of urgency creeping into his steps. He could feel the weight of the general's presence lingering in the room, and it made him anxious. This wasn't just any mistake he'd made. It was a mistake that could have cost him far more than his job. He reached the door and knocked lightly. The woman from earlier, the one who had been the first to recognize the general, glanced up from her desk. She didn't say anything at first, just motioned for him to come in. "We need to get this sorted," the officer said, his voice a little more serious now. "The general's waiting, and I don't want to delay anything else." The woman nodded. She was already dialing a number on the phone, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. "I'll make sure everything's processed quickly. Just give me a second." The officer took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He had no idea what was coming next. He wasn't used to dealing with people like the general, people who had been through things he couldn't even begin to imagine. He could hear the muffled voice on the other end of the line, someone on the other side asking questions. The woman spoke into the phone with a tone that was both professional and calm. "Yes, General Richardson is here. I just need confirmation on his status and authorization to update his records." There was a pause. Then the woman's expression changed. Her eyebrows knitted together, and she quickly scribbled something down on a piece of paper. The officer watched her carefully, waiting for the next step. "Okay," she said finally, hanging up the phone. "Everything checks out. We'll update his information right away. You can let him know we're taking care of it." The officer nodded and turned to walk back to the front. As he left the office, his thoughts raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something important, something bigger than himself. He had gone from mocking the general to seeing him in a whole new light in just a matter of minutes. As he returned to the front desk, the man was still standing where he had been before, calm and composed, as though none of this had ever mattered to him. The officer walked over, holding out the now updated ID. "General," he began, his voice steady, "everything's taken care of. Your records have been updated. We've made the necessary changes." The general nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. It wasn't the kind of nod someone gave when they were impressed. It was just a nod, as if he had expected this all along. The officer hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sir, I really want to apologize for what happened earlier, for the way I spoke to you." The general didn't reply right away. Instead, he just glanced at the officer for a moment, his eyes cool but not angry. Then, with a small movement, he gave the officer one last nod. It was brief, but it was enough to let the officer know that the apology had been accepted, even if it wasn't necessary. The officer watched as the general turned and walked out of the office, his steps steady, the kind of confidence that only comes from having lived through things most people couldn't imagine. He didn't look back. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet. It was the kind of quiet that settled in after a lesson had been learned, a lesson that would stick with the officer for a long time. The officer stood behind the counter for a long moment after the general walked out. His hands were still shaking, though he tried to hide it by gripping the edge of the desk. He had never felt so out of place. The general had walked out of that room with the same quiet dignity he had entered with, and the officer had been left standing there, feeling smaller than he ever had before. His coworkers were still silent, their eyes darting between him and the door the general had just passed through. No one knew what to say. They'd all witnessed the change, the shift in atmosphere, but none of them really understood what had just happened. Finally, the woman who had spoken up earlier cleared her throat. "You're lucky," she said quietly. "You could have made a much bigger mess than you did." The officer looked up at her, his face a mixture of confusion and regret. "I know. I didn't. I didn't know who he was. I just thought." "You assumed," she interrupted gently. "You assumed because of a piece of paper. That's not how it works here. Not with people who've given so much." He swallowed, his throat dry. He'd heard the stories. Everyone had. But hearing about the general's accomplishments, his history, his service, was nothing like standing in the same room with him. The general had given his life to his country, sacrificed, led, fought, and yet here he was, standing quietly, without needing to say a word about it. "I shouldn't have said those things," the officer muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I shouldn't have joked. It wasn't funny." The woman gave him a long look, and this time there was no sympathy in her eyes. "You've learned your lesson, but I hope you won't forget it. We don't get to treat people like that, especially not those who've served. It's a privilege to be in this office, and you'll never forget who you're serving." He nodded slowly, still feeling the sting of embarrassment. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about what had led up to it. What had made him think that his own comfort, his own jokes, could be more important than the dignity of a man who had given so much. The woman turned to her desk, picking up a few papers. "Get it together, officer. We have work to do. And next time a veteran walks in here, remember they're more than what you see on the surface." He stood there for a moment longer, his thoughts spinning. He had been so careless, so quick to judge, but now the memory of the general's presence, the quiet power in the way he had carried himself, would stay with him forever. As the officer started to gather himself, he glanced around the room. No one else was laughing. No one else was making jokes. There was an unspoken respect in the air now, something that hadn't been there before. He had learned the hard way, but at least he had learned. And as he got back to his tasks, he couldn't shake the feeling that his understanding of service, of respect, had changed forever. The rest of the day felt different for the officer. The usual hum of the office was still there, the ringing phones, the chatter between coworkers, the shuffle of papers, but something had shifted. He couldn't stop thinking about the general. It wasn't just the call from the Pentagon or the sudden respect he had for the man. It was everything, the quiet strength, the way the general had carried himself, and most of all, the lessons the officer hadn't even realized he needed to learn. As the day went on, the officer noticed the small things. People were gentler with each other, holding doors open for one another, speaking with a little more patience. It was as if the entire office had been quietly humbled by the presence of someone who had lived through so much. But the officer still couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment. Every time he thought about his own words about mocking the general for something as small as an expired it, he felt a deep pang of regret. He had no excuse for it. No good reason why he hadn't taken a moment to ask questions instead of making assumptions. During lunch, a coworker who had seen the exchange pulled him aside. "Hey, you all right?" she asked gently. He nodded, though he wasn't sure if he felt okay. "Yeah, just thinking." "I get it," she said, leaning against the counter. "We'd all mess up sometimes, but not everyone gets the chance you did to make it right. You learned something today." He glanced at her, unsure of what to say. "I don't know if I deserve to be forgiven for it," he muttered. She shrugged. "No one's asking you to forgive yourself, but it's done. Just don't forget what happened. Learn from it." He nodded slowly, trying to take in her words, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the general's face, calm, steady, unshaken. He couldn't forget that moment. It was burned into his memory. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. The officer kept his head down, focusing on his tasks, trying not to dwell too much on the past. He didn't know if he would ever get another chance to apologize to the general, but he hoped one day, if their paths crossed again, he would have the right words. As the sun began to set, the office quieted down. The officer started to gather his things, ready to leave for the day. But as he walked to the door, He stopped and glanced at the counter where the general had stood not so long ago. The woman who had spoken to him earlier caught his gaze. "You'll be all right," she said, offering a small smile. "Just keep this lesson with you. It's one you won't forget." He nodded again, silently thankful for her kindness. He didn't need to hear anything more. The message had already hit home. As he walked out into the evening air, the officer felt a shift inside of him. It wasn't something that would go away in a day or even a week. It was a change in how he saw the world, how he saw the people who walked through that office every day. And he knew, deep down, that this lesson would stay with him for a long time to come. A week had passed since the general had walked into the office, and things had slowly returned to normal. The officer had tried his best to put what happened behind him, but there were still moments when the memory hit him hard. It was like a stone dropped into water, and the ripples lingered far longer than he expected. He couldn't stop thinking about how quickly he had judged the general, how easily he let the expired id be the reason he dismissed him. The thought still stung. Today, the officer was sitting at his desk, trying to focus on paperwork, when the door opened. The woman from the front desk, the one who had given him that hard lesson, stepped inside with a slight smile on her face. "You've got someone here to see you," she said. The officer looked up, his heart skipping a beat. He had no idea who could be coming to visit him. But then, as if the universe had a strange sense of humor, he saw the familiar figure standing in the doorway. It was the general. The officer's breath caught in his throat. For a second, it felt like time had stopped. The general stood there, dressed in a simple jacket, looking every bit the same as he had when he walked in a week ago, calm, collected, and carrying a weight of history that no one else could understand. The officer stood up quickly, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this. Had he come back to check on the records, to make sure the updates had been made? But the general didn't speak immediately. He simply nodded to the officer, as if acknowledging the unspoken understanding between them. "General," the officer said, his voice steady but respectful. "What can I do for you?" The general's gaze softened just slightly. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice low but clear. The officer blinked. "Thank me? For what?" "For the way you handled things," the general continued, stepping a little closer. "You didn't shy away from your mistake. You apologized and you learned from it. That means something. Not many people do that." The officer felt a wave of surprise wash over him. He was thanking me. "I didn't expect that," the officer admitted, still trying to process it all. "But I meant what I said. I was wrong. I should have treated you with respect from the beginning." The general nodded. "And you did. In the end, you did. It's easy to get caught up in assumptions, in what we think we know. But it's the ones who admit their mistakes and change who earn respect." The officer stood still for a moment, the weight of the general's words sinking in. He had learned this lesson the hard way, but standing here now, hearing the general speak, it felt like a full circle moment. "Thank you, sir," the officer said quietly. "I won't forget this." The general gave a small, approving nod. "You'll be fine," he said, turning toward the door. "Just keep learning. That's all anyone can do." The officer watched him leave, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't expected. The general hadn't come back for an apology. He hadn't come back to correct him. He had come back to show that even the smallest gestures of respect mattered, and that was a lesson the officer would carry with him always. As the door closed behind the general, the officer sat back down at his desk. He wasn't the same person who had mocked the man with the expired id a week ago. Something inside him had shifted, something deeper than just a change in attitude. He had been given a rare gift, a lesson that would stay with him forever.